The Constitution of the Philippines, popularly known as the 1987 Constitution, is the constitution or the supreme law of the Republic of the Philippines. It was enacted in 1987, during the administration of President Corazon C. Aquino. Philippine constitutional law experts recognized three other previous constitutions as having effectively governed the country: the 1935 Commonwealth Constitution, the 1973 Constitution, and the 1986 Freedom Constitution. Two further constitutions were drafted and adopted during two short-lived wartime governments, by the revolutionary forces during the Philippine Revolution with Emilio Aguinaldo as president, and by the occupation forces during the Japanese occupation of the Philippines during World War II with José P. Laurel as president. Background of the 1987 Constitution: in 1986, following the People Power Revolution which ousted Ferdinand E. Marcos as president, and following on her own inauguration, Corazon C. Aquino issued Proclamation 3, declaring a national policy to implement the reforms mandated by the people, protecting their basic rights, adopting a provisional constitution, and providing for an orderly transition to a government under a new constitution. President Aquino later issued Proclamation R9, creating a constitutional commission to frame a new charter to supersede the Marcos-era 1973 constitution. Aquino appointed 50 members to the commission. The members of the commission were drawn from varied backgrounds, including several former congressmen, former Supreme Court Chief Justice Roberto Concepta Cuden, Roman Catholic Bishop Teodoro Bacani, and film director Lino Brocca. Aquino also deliberately appointed 5 members, including former Labor Minister Blas Ople, who had been allied with Marcos until the latter's ouster. After the commission had convened, it elected Cecilia Mua plus or minus Ospalma as its president. Mua plus or minus Ospalma had emerged as a leading figure in the anti-Marcos opposition movement following her retirement as the first female Associate Justice of the Supreme Court. The commission finished the draft charter within 4 months after convening. Several issues were heatedly debated during the sessions, including on the form of government to adopt, the abolition of the death penalty, the continued retention of the Clark and Subak American military bases, and the integration of economic policies into the Constitution. Brocca would walk out of the commission before its completion, and 2 other delegates would dissent from the final draft. The CONCOM completed their task on October 12, 1986 and presented the draft constitution to President Aquino on October 15, 1986. After a nationwide information campaign, a plebiscite for its ratification was held on February 2, 1987. More than 3/4 of all votes cast, or 76.37% favored ratification versus 22.65% who voted against it. On February 11, 1987, the new constitution was proclaimed, ratified and made effective, with Aquino, her government, and the services pledging allegiance to it later that day. Parts of the 1987 Constitution: the Constitution is divided into 18 parts which are called Articles. Article I, National Territory; Article II, Declaration of Principles and State Policies; Article III, Bill of Rights; Article IV, Citizenship; Article V, Suffrage; Article VI, Legislative Department; Article VII, Executive Department; Article VIII, Judicial Department; Article IX, Constitutional Commission; Article X, Local Government; Article XI, Accountability of Public Officers; Article 12, National Economy and Patrimony; Article 13, Social Justice and Human Rights; Article 14, Education, Science and Technology, Arts, Culture and Sports; Article 15, The Family; Article 16, General Provisions; Article 17, Amendments or Revisions; Article 18, Transitory Provisions. Preamble of the 1987 Constitution. The preamble reads, "Significant features of the 1987 Constitution. The Constitution establishes the Philippines as a democratic and republican state, where sovereignty resides in the people and all government authority emanates from them. Consistent with the doctrine of separation of powers, the powers of the national government are exercised in main by 3 branches: the legislative branch composed of Congress, the executive branch headed by the President, and the judicial branch with the Supreme Court occupying the highest tier of the judiciary. The President and the members of Congress are directly elected by the people, while the members of the Supreme Court are appointed by the President from a list formed by the Judicial and Bar Council. As with the American system of government, it is Congress which enacts the laws, subject to the veto power of the President, which may nonetheless be overturned by a two-thirds vote of Congress, Article 6. The President has the constitutional duty to ensure the faithful execution of the laws, while the courts are expressly granted the power of judicial review, including the power to nullify or interpret laws. The President is also recognized as the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. The Constitution also establishes limited political autonomy to the local government units that act as the municipal governments for provinces, cities, municipalities, and barangays. Local governments are generally considered as falling under the executive branch, yet local legislation requires enactment by duly elected local legislative bodies. The Constitution mandated that the Congress would enact a local government code. The Congress duly enacted Republic Act No. 7160, the Local Government Code of 1991, which became effective on January 1, 1992. The Supreme Court has noted that the Bill of Rights occupies a position of primacy in the fundamental law. The Bill of Rights, contained in Article 3, enumerates the specific protections against state power. Many of these guarantees are similar to those provided in the American Constitution and other democratic constitutions, including the Due Process and Equal Protection Clause, the right against unwarranted searches and seizures, the right to free speech and the free exercise of religion, the right against self-incrimination, and the right to habeas corpus. The scope and limitations to these rights have largely been determined by Philippine Supreme Court decisions. Outside of the Bill of Rights, the Constitution also contains several other provisions enumerating various state policies, including, that is, the affirmation of labor as a primary social-economic force, the equal protection of the life of the mother and the life of the unborn from conception, the Filipino family as the foundation of the nation, the recognition of Filipino as the national language of the Philippines, and even a requirement that all educational institutions shall undertake regular sports activities throughout the country in cooperation with athletic clubs and other sectors. Whether these provisions may, by themselves, be the source of enforceable rights without accompanying legislation has been the subject of considerable debate in the legal sphere and within the Supreme Court. The Court, for example, has ruled that a provision requiring that the state guarantee equal access to opportunities to public service could not be enforced without accompanying legislation, and thus could not bar the disallowance of so-called nuisance candidates in presidential elections. But in another case, the court held that a provision requiring that the state protect and advance the right of the people to a balanced and healthful ecology did not require implementing legislation to become the source of operative rights. Historical constitutions, Constitution of Biak na Bato. The Katipunan Revolution led to the Tejeros Convention where, at San Francisco de Malabacubden, Cavite, on March 22, 1897, the first presidential and vice-presidential elections in Philippine history were held although only the Katipuneros were able to take part, and not the general populace. A later meeting of the revolutionary government established there, held on November 1, 1897 at Biak na Bato in the town of San Miguel de Memo in Bulacan, established the Republic of Biak na Bato. The Republic had a constitution drafted by Isabelo Artacho and FAR copyright Lix Ferrer and based on the first Cuban constitution. It is known as the Constitución Cubana Provisional de la República de Filipinas, and was originally written in and promulgated in the Spanish and Tagalog languages. Malolos Constitution. The Malolos Constitution was the first republican constitution in Asia. It declared that sovereignty resides exclusively in the people, stated basic civil rights, separated the church and state, and called for the creation of an Assembly of Representatives to act as the legislative body. It also called for a parliamentary republic as the form of government. The president was elected for a term of 4 years by a majority of the Assembly. It was titled Constitución Cubana Politica, and was written in Spanish following the Declaration of Independence from Spain, proclaimed on January 20, 1899, and was enacted and ratified by the Malolos Congress, a congress held in Malolos, Bulacan. The preamble reads, "We, the representatives of the Filipino people, lawfully convened in order to establish justice, provide for common defense, promote the general welfare, and ensure the benefits of liberty, imploring the aid of the sovereign legislator of the universe for the attainment of these ends, have voted, decreed, and sanctioned the following acts of the United States Congress. The Philippines was a United States territory from December 10, 1898 to March 24, 1934, and therefore under the jurisdiction of the federal government of the United States. Two acts of the United States Congress passed during this period can be considered Philippine constitutions in that those acts define the fundamental political principles and established the structure, procedures, powers and duties of the Philippine government. Philippine Organic Act of 1902. The Philippine Organic Act of 1902, sometimes known as the Philippine Bill of 1902, was the first organic law for the Philippine Islands enacted by the United States Congress. It provided for the creation of a popularly elected Philippine Assembly, and specified that legislative power would be vested in a bicameral legislature composed of the Philippine Commission and the Philippine Assembly. Its key provisions included a Bill of Rights for the Filipinos and the appointment of two non-voting Filipino resident commissioner of the Philippines to represent the Philippines in the United States House of Representatives. Philippine Autonomy Act of 1916. The Philippine Autonomy Act of 1916, sometimes known as Jones Law, modified the structure of the Philippine government by removing the Philippine Commission as the legislative upper house and replacing it with a Senate elected by Filipino voters, creating the Philippines' first fully elected national legislature. This act also explicitly stated that it was and had always been the purpose of the people of the United States to end their sovereignty over the Philippine Islands and to recognize Philippine independence as soon as a stable government can be established therein. Tidings-McDuffie Act, though not a constitution itself, the Tidings-McDuffie Act of 1934 provided authority and defined mechanisms for the establishment of a formal constitution via a constitutional convention. Commonwealth and Third Republic. The 1935 Constitution was written in 1934, approved and adopted by the Commonwealth of the Philippines and later used by the Third Republic. It was written with an eye to meeting the approval of the United States government as well, so as to ensure that the U.S. would live up to its promise to grant the Philippines independence and not have a premise to hold on to its possession on the grounds that it was too politically immature and hence unready for full, real independence. The preamble reads, "The original 1935 Constitution provided for unicameral National Assembly and the President was elected to a 6-year term without re-election. It was amended in 1940 to have a bicameral Congress composed of a Senate and House of Representatives, as well the creation of an independent electoral commission. The Constitution now granted the President a 4-year term with a maximum of 2 consecutive terms in office. A constitutional convention was held in 1971 to rewrite the 1935 Constitution. The convention was stained with manifest bribery and corruption. Possibly the most controversial issue was removing the presidential term limit so that Ferdinand E. Marcos could seek election for a 3rd term, which many felt was the true reason for which the convention was called. In any case, the 1935 Constitution was suspended in 1972 with Marcos' proclamation of martial law, the rampant corruption of the constitutional process providing him with one of his major premises for doing so. Second Republic. The 1943 Constitution was drafted by a committee appointed by the Philippine Executive Commission, the body established by the Japanese to administer the Philippines in lieu of the Commonwealth of the Philippines which had established a government in exile. In mid-1942 Japanese Premier Hideki Tojo had promised the Filipinos the honor of independence, which meant that the commission would be supplanted by a formal republic. The Preparatory Committee for Philippine Independence tasked with drafting a new constitution was composed in large part of members of the pre-war National Assembly and of individuals with experience as delegates to the convention that had drafted the 1935 Constitution. Their draft for the republic to be established under the Japanese occupation, however, would be limited in duration, provide for indirect, instead of direct, legislative elections, and an even stronger executive branch. Upon approval of the draft by the committee, the new charter was ratified in 1943 by an assembly of appointed, provincial representatives of the Calabape, the organization established by the Japanese to supplant all previous political parties. Upon ratification by the Calabape Assembly, the Second Republic was formally proclaimed. José P. Laurel was appointed as president by the National Assembly and inaugurated into office in October 1943. Laurel was highly regarded by the Japanese for having openly criticized the U.S. for the way they ran the Philippines, and because he had a degree from Tokyo International University. The 1943 Constitution remained in force in Japanese-controlled areas of the Philippines, but was never recognized as legitimate or binding by the governments of the United States or of the Commonwealth of the Philippines and guerrilla organizations loyal to them. In late 1944, President Laurel declared a state of war existed with the United States and the British Empire and proclaimed martial law, essentially ruling by decree. His government in turn went into exile in December 1944, first to Taiwan and then Japan. After the announcement of Japan's surrender, Laurel formally proclaimed the Second Republic as dissolved. Until the 1960s, the Second Republic, and its officers, were not viewed as legitimate or as having any standing, with the exception of the Supreme Court, whose decisions, limited to reviews of criminal and commercial cases as part of the policy of discretion by Chief Justice José P. continued to be part of the official records. It was only during the Macapagal administration that a partial political rehabilitation of the Japanese-era republic took place, with the official recognition of Laurel as a former president and the addition of his cabinet and other officials to the roster of past government officials. However, the 1943 Charter was not taught in schools and the laws of the 1943-44 National Assembly never recognized as valid or relevant. The preamble reads, "The 1943 Constitution provided strong executive powers. The legislature consisted of a unicameral National Assembly and only those considered to be anti-US could stand for election, although in practice most legislators were appointed rather than elected. The new society and the Fourth Republic, the 1973 Constitution, promulgated after Marcos' declaration of martial law, but having been in the planning process for years before this, was supposed to introduce a parliamentary-style government. Legislative power was vested in a unicameral National Assembly whose members were elected for 6-year terms. The president was ideally elected as the symbolic and purely ceremonial head of state chosen from amongst the members of the National Assembly for a 6-year term and could be re-elected to an unlimited number of terms. Upon election, the president ceased to be a member of the National Assembly. During his term, the president was not allowed to be a member of a political party or hold any other office. Executive power was meant to be exercised by the Prime Minister who was also elected from amongst the sitting assemblymen. The Prime Minister was to be the head of government and Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. This constitution was subsequently amended 4 times. From 16 to 17 October 1976, a majority of barangay voters approved that martial law should be continued and ratified the amendments to the Constitution proposed by President Marcos. The 1976 amendments were, an interim Batasang Pambansa substituting for the interim National Assembly. The President would also become the Prime Minister and he would continue to exercise legislative powers until such time as martial law was lifted. The Sixth Amendment authorized the President to legislate on his own on an emergency basis. Whenever in the judgment of the President there exists a grave emergency or a threat or imminence thereof, or whenever the interim Batasang Pambansa or the regular National Assembly fails or is unable to act adequately on any matter for any reason that in his judgment requires immediate action, he may, in order to meet the exigency, issue the necessary decrees, orders or letters of instructions, which shall form part of the law of the land. The 1973 Constitution was further amended in 1980 and 1981. In the 1980 amendment, the retirement age of the members of the judiciary was extended to 70 years. In the 1981 amendments, the false parliamentary system was formally modified into a French-style semi-presidential system. Executive power was restored to the president. Direct election of the president was restored. An executive committee composed of the prime minister and not more than 14 members was created to assist the president in the exercise of his powers and functions and in the performance of his duties as he may prescribe. And the prime minister was a mere head of the cabinet. Further, the amendments instituted electoral reforms and provided that a natural-born citizen of the Philippines who has lost his citizenship may be a transferee of private land for use by him as his residence. The last amendments in 1984 abolished the Executive Committee and restored the position of Vice President. While the 1973 Constitution ideally provided for a true parliamentary system, in practice, Marcos had made use of subterfuge and manipulation in order to keep executive powers for himself, rather than devolving these to the Assembly and the Cabinet headed by the Prime Minister. The end result was that the final form of the 1973 Constitution after all amendments and subtle manipulations was merely the abolition of the Senate and a series of cosmetic rewordings. The old American-derived terminology was replaced by terms more associated with parliamentary government. For example, the House of Representatives became known as the Batasang Pambansa, departments were called ministries, and their cabinet secretaries became known as cabinet ministers, with the president's assistant the executive secretary now being styled a prime minister, so that Marcos' purported parliamentary system functioned as an authoritarian presidential system, with all real power concentrated in the hands of the president but with the premise that such was now constitutional. Freedom Constitution. Immediately following the 1986 People Power Revolution that ousted Marcos, President Corazon C. Aquino issued Proclamation R3 as a provisional constitution. It adopted certain provisions from the 1973 Constitution while abolishing others. It granted the president broad powers to reorganize government and remove officials, as well as mandating the president to appoint a commission to draft a new, more formal constitution. This document, described above, supplanted the Freedom Constitution upon its ratification in 1987. See also, Constitutional Economics, Constitutionalism, Charter Change, References. Bibliography, Cruz, Izagani. The Nature of the Constitution. Constitutional Law. Philippines, Central Law Book Publishing Company, Incorporated PPA 18 20. ISBN A971-16-0333-0. External links, A collection of Philippine constitutions, Biak-na-Bato Constitution, Biak-na-Bato Constitution Spanish version, Biak-na-Bato Constitution Tagalog version, the 1899 Malolos Constitution, Philippine Organic Act, Philippine Autonomy Act, the 1935 Constitution with amendments, the 1935 Constitution, the 1943 Constitution, the 1973 Constitution with amendments, the 1973 Constitution, the 1986 Freedom Constitution, the 1987 Constitution, the Consultative Commission, Evolution of Philippine Constitution.